There we go. Well, thanks again, and thanks for the invitation to present. It's a privilege to be here with this group. I've joined a few times just as a participant, and it's always been really informative and engaging, and so I'm really happy to be here again. So for some of you, you may know the Lincoln Institute's been involved in work around value capture for decades now, and occasionally the climate angle has been incorporated, sustainability, conservation angle, but really only in the past few years have we really started to think about how value capture and climate change and climate investments interplay. So we've started to commission some research that's exploring exactly that. Earlier this year, we published a lit review on climate adaptation investments and their impacts on property values, which has led to several other research projects exploring kind of more specific topics that are underway now. So we're starting to make the connections between value capture and climate action, largely, as David was mentioning, given the the current sense of emergency that the climate crisis is putting on us. So today I thought I would give a quick overview of value capture generally, and then start to make the climate connections a bit more specifically. I know many of you are very familiar with value capture, probably more so than I am in some instances, but maybe there are others who are less familiar. So if the overview on value capture and the rationales are a refresher, I suppose that doesn't hurt either. So we'll start with a higher level, just overview of value capture in general, look at the relationship between climate investments and land values, go a little bit into the different types of value capture instruments that are out there, a quick overview of some examples, and then open it up for a discussion, which I hope will be very engaging. I hope there will be some questions generated throughout the discussion or throughout the presentation that we can discuss. I know you all have a lot of great experience and perspectives to bring that we'd love to hear. So quickly, why value capture for climate action? Well, we know that less than half of the trillions of dollars needed for climate action are currently being met through existing financial flows, and cities often can't access a lot of these traditional financial instruments due to legal or institutional or technical capacity constraints. So there's not enough money coming down, and what money there is often inaccessible. So value capture presents a potential own source revenue stream that provides more autonomy over the management of these resources. But more importantly, it provides an own source revenue stream that could be leveraged to access other sources of financing, such as debt financing. And I'll say this again, but I want to be clear that I'm not saying that value capture presents this magical revenue stream that can solve budget deficits and clear project backlogs. But through value capture and through the strengthening of municipal fiscal health, you can leverage those to access other resources, and responding to the climate crisis really does require kind of pulling from all available funding streams, and you can't really leave any money on the table. And then finally, there's this opportunity for a virtuous cycle that public actions on climate mitigation and adaptation, we're seeing they have a positive impact on land values, and because of this can create these new opportunities for urban development, which can then be used to incorporate yet additional climate positive investments and elements. So now we'll get into kind of what is land value capture. So it's a policy approach, and in some regards, you may consider it a philosophy that enables communities to recover and reinvest land value increases that result from public investment and public actions. So the basic tenet of value capture is that public action should generate public benefit. increases in private land values that result from government action should be at least partially recovered by the public. There's a wide array of different policy instruments related to value capture that have been used globally successfully in both developing and mature economies. Some common examples, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail, but special assessments, impact fees, betterment levies, transfer of development rights, land readjustment, charges for development rights. All of these are value capture instruments that are used widely. And I would argue that value capture instruments are far more widespread than most realize. We just finished a global compendium on value capture, which was a partnership with OECD and the Lincoln Institute. And it included a survey of 60 countries, and all 60 countries responded that they use some form of value capture, at least on an occasional basis. So it's being used. Perhaps it may not be clearly labeled value capture, which may present kind of a misunderstanding, but there's a lot of policies that are currently being used. And as a process, we see value capture having these three interrelated parts. First, there's the value creation stage, which is when the government takes some sort of action that results in an increased land value. And this could be physical infrastructure, such as a road or a light rail line or a park, or it could be administrative action, such as a zoning change or changes to a building code. And then the second phase is the value capture or value recovery stage. This is when the specific value capture instrument is used to recover part of this land value increment. Or the choice of which instrument to use depends on a lot of factors: the local context, how the proceeds may be utilized, what is the type of action that's generating the value increment. And then finally, there's this value distribution stage, also known as the land value return stage, which is when the recovered land value is then reinvested in public benefit, which is a really important piece of this, that the funds that have been recovered should be used in a way that both promotes equity and generates a demonstrable public benefit. You know, the public needs to be able to see how this was being used, which we found to be really critical to public perception and therefore the success of the instrument. And we'll get into each one of these in a little bit more detail. But first, I wanted to really underscore, how land values increase, and what are the major drivers of land values, particularly in an urbanizing context. So from this illustration, you can see there's an undeveloped, unserviced plot of land. Pardon the dog barking. So the value of this plot of land is currently pretty low. It's inaccessible, doesn't have any infrastructure or services that could support many uses. But the government decides to invest in infrastructure, a road, or perhaps a light rail line that increases its accessibility, and its value goes up. But it's important to note that this is just from a government action, and the owner of this plot of land didn't necessarily do anything. And now if the local government decides to rezone this land to accommodate more intense uses, you're going to see the value increase even more. And this conversion from rural land to urban uses and the accompanying services and infrastructure that it requires has been shown to result in land value increases of between 400 and 600%, which represents a really massive windfall to the landowner. But you can also imagine kind of regulatory administrative actions to increase allowable densities and heights, will also result in higher land values. You can build more on the same plot of land, its value will increase. And additional amenities like street trees and parks and green infrastructure and a lot of other things also represent the types of public investments that lead to an increase in property values. And you can imagine many other types of actions in response to climate change that may impact property values. But really the important takeaway here is that the value of land increased significantly only because of these government actions, not actions of the landowner, yet it's the landowner who's receiving the windfall. So value capture proposes that some of this increment, a portion of it, is returned to public coffers to be used for public benefit. So in a quick summary here, we're seeing a lot of different demands being placed on cities and they're ill prepared to respond to them given a lack of resources. But they're sitting on this largely untapped resource in land, which could be used to finance development as land value increases are a result from these public interventions. And this increment is typically much higher than the cost of the actual infrastructure investment. And perhaps more importantly, value captures represents kind of a more equal distribution of the cost and benefits of urban development or responding to climate change. And as I mentioned before, it's all underlined by this core premise that public action, again, should generate public benefit. So how does climate action come into play here? Well, we're seeing local governments, national governments are already acting on climate through a range of interventions and investments, including changes to land use regulations and building codes, investments to transition from gray infrastructure to green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, investments in low carbon mobility systems. And all of these are the very actions that make government significant actors in the processes that generate land values, which is a hugely underappreciated relationship from my perspective. So all the examples listed here, from your physical infrastructure, but also regulatory actions, like land use and zoning designations, resilient zoning, transit-oriented development, they're all the types of public actions at the local level that are positively affecting land values and open up the possibility of using value capture instruments to help promote them more. And just to kind of further emphasize, here's a few more examples of this relationship between climate action and property values, which there's a growing body of evidence to build upon that's showing this relationship, both on direct infrastructure investments and administrative action. And we'll go through a couple of these, but it's important to note that these impacts are very context specific, and land values are influenced by a lot of factors. So what may be the increment in Portland, for example, of urban trees and increased tree cover is not going to be the exact same impact in Florida or Colombia, for example. But they are very representative, and even if they aren't directly transferable. But you see urban trees and tree cover having a significant positive relationship on land values. An interesting thing that's coming out of a lot of these studies is there's generally a positive association with being close to a tree or multiple trees, but what really is the more important factor is the increase in tree canopy overall. So it's not the one tree that's having the major impact, it's kind of the collective of the tree canopy. Likewise, green infrastructure and open space. Several studies documenting that relationship, the positive relationship on land values. For example, in St. Louis, there's a study that showed for every 1,000 feet closer you were to a greenway, there was an associated 1% increase in land values. In Buenos Aires, there was even a much more significant value calculated for daylighting a stream and incorporating a lot of green infrastructure. You saw not only an increase in the flood protection offered, but also up to or more than a 30% increase in the land value for properties that were close by. Similarly, urban form, walkable, people-centered urban form, it comes with an increase in land values, and public transportation is perhaps the most widely documented of these relationships that you can see upwards of 20% increases in land values related to proximity to transit. Air quality is another one that isn't listed here, but it's another important kind of co-benefit of climate action that has measurable impacts to property values. And there's several really interesting studies coming out of China showing that. And those were kind of some specific investments and their impact, but we're thinking through this and trying to kind of generalize this into, we came up with these 3 buckets of the ways that public action on climate change may impact land values. And some of these are very obvious, some are a little bit more complex, but are helpful to help kind of set the stage and think through how value capture can relate to climate change. So the first of these is the publicly protected lands, a public intervention to protect areas that are vulnerable, will certainly prevent a loss of property values, but what we're seeing is actually not only just prevent the loss, but they increase property values. It's really important to note in these situations, there's a huge risk of maladaptation if the intervention is inadequate or doesn't consider the appropriate social or ecological dimensions. And in that case, properties may be perceived as being protected and their land values may go up, but in fact, they're still vulnerable or potentially even more vulnerable. So a really important consideration to have in mind. The second one is kind of thinking about the co-benefits of climate resilient development. So responding to the climate crisis is going to require huge investments in new and retrofitted infrastructure, the form of low carbon climate resilient development in the form of people-oriented urban form, high quality green space, public transportation. They all bring additional amenities that are reflected in higher land values. As I mentioned, air quality is one. As you're shifting from coal-powered or gas-powered cars, the associated increases in air quality also impact land values. But then finally, there's this idea of the climate advantaged land that, the impacts of climate change will make some land more valuable due to certain natural advantages or natural features. So, it's going to favor these higher elevation coastal lands or lands that have access to fresh water, ecologically diverse lands, fertile lands, high renewable energy potential. We are seeing that you're already seeing an increase in land values with these certain types of land. So, for example, in Miami, the value of higher elevation properties have risen over the past few decades, while those in lower elevation areas have declined. And while these increases in land values are simply a result of climate change, not from public action, it is the responsibility of local governments to respond with the appropriate action to prevent speculation and displacement. So local governments could choose to allow for greater density in areas less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in order to accommodate people displaced from more vulnerable areas, which there you could see a generation of additional land values. So now that we understand this relationship between land values and climate action a bit more, which really is that first step of the value capture process, what instruments should be used? And like a good planner, it depends. Context is important. Your legal and institutional frameworks, political climate, and culture, political will. But we're going to focus on these 4 different types of value capture tools that, again, were this same framework was used in the recent Global Compendium of Value Capture, which I can, there's a link included in this presentation. I can share the slides. So the 4 categories of value capture tools include infrastructure levies, which are taxes or fees levied on landowners that possess land that has gained value due to government action. So these could be special assessments, betterment contributions, for example. There's then charges for development rights, which are cash or in-kind contributions paid in exchange for development rights above a set density baseline. And you're seeing these are very common, starting to be more common in Latin America in particular. Developer obligations, impact fees, as they're kind of common here in the US. Again, cash or in-kind contributions that are going to offset or defray the costs for additional infrastructure as a result of the development. And then the final category is land readjustment, which is the practice of pooling fragmented land parcels for joint development. So the owners may transfer a portion of their land for public use that could go towards infrastructure improvements. The owners who participate in this are likely going to get a smaller piece of land after the process, but it'll have a higher value and be more better serviced and have upgraded infrastructure. So as you can see, there's a lot of different value capture instruments that could be used. Some may be more suitable for different types of climate action. And this chart here starts to kind of map those the different types of adaptation and mitigation measures with the different types of value capture instruments. So you can think of climate investments with really direct benefits to specific properties like a seawall or a levee, or green infrastructure that reduces like really localized flooding, new low carbon transit lines, things like that could utilize an infrastructure levy, like a special assessment or a betterment contribution. If you're thinking about more climate resilient urban form, such as increased density, integrated green infrastructure, those could be promoted with charges for additional building rights. You could utilize impact fees or development obligations to pay for additional costs of protecting new residents or infrastructure from the increasing impacts of climate change. In some situations, the most appropriate adaptation measure may be relocation, which you could think of potentially transfer of development rights could be utilized to transition development from areas of high risk to areas out of harm's way. And thinking about land readjustment could be utilized to improve services, integrate adaptation measures in poorly serviced neighborhoods that are vulnerable to climate impacts. But it could also be used thinking about new infrastructure associated with decarbonized and decentralized energy sources, the reconfiguration of land that may be required for that. Land readjustment could be a helpful instrument. And then finally, the property tax, or even more directly, a land value tax, could be used to capture increases from climate action that may be difficult to communicate or that have kind of more diffuse impacts, like air quality improvements or increases in tree canopy. So there's a lot of different instruments that could be used, kind of depending on the type of action and the particular context. But getting to that final phase of the process that was mentioned before, once value increases resulting from a public action have been generated, identified, recovered, they can then be reinvested in yet more equitable climate resilient actions. And so as the public benefit of these investments in climate mitigation and adaptation are realized, the surrounding areas, may become more attractive to additional investment and development that has the potential to create this virtuous cycle of revenue generation and growth and improved resilience. And this cycle is especially true thinking about rapidly urbanizing regions where there's a need to kind of be more forward thinking in terms of the infrastructure planning and financing in advance of growth, which without that forward thinking often leads to informal settlements and the need to then kind of retrofit already built environments, which is much more costly and difficult to do. And as I mentioned before, revenues from value capture aren't going to resolve budget limitations on their own, but they could be used, the revenue generated could be used to leverage additional sources of financing. But beyond just as a source of revenue, its success is really tied to proper land management and planning, which itself can influence land markets and development to be more climate resilient. So it's both kind of a planning tool, but then a source of revenue. So there are already a few. There's many examples of value capture being used for kind of climate resilient actions. Here's a few that we've selected. So in Boston, in the Seaport District, which if you're not familiar with Boston, it's a very formerly industrial area that now is rapidly being developed with high-end luxury condos, but it's also probably one of the most vulnerable areas of the city. I think the First Street Foundation report found that like 90% of roads and critical infrastructure will be flooded by 2050. So obviously climate adaptation is important in that context. And so the city is funding adaptation improvements such as seawalls and green infrastructure through developer contributions to what they're calling a climate resiliency fund in exchange for development rights. And they're hoping to gather $40 million to fund these critical improvements. One could argue might not be the best place to be developing so densely now, but to adapt to that, they're leveraging value capture. Another example is in Curitiba, where they're using and have been for a couple of decades a transfer development rights program to implement a large-scale park system to absorb floodwaters, while also relocating informal settlements located in really high-risk flood zones. So through this program, property owners in high-risk or environmentally sensitive areas obtain the right to build in designated areas of the city while their properties are converted into parks and green infrastructure. I'm gonna, I'll quickly go through these last two. Tokyo has used land readjustment often to fund light rail systems. In this particular case that we're mentioning, it's the extension of a low carbon rail line and the creation of this transit-oriented suburban development. So land was pooled and reconfigured for new stations, rights of way, housing, renewable energy production, and private landowners saw an increase in their land value of more than 40%, despite a reduction in their total acreage. And then finally in Quito, they've leveraged the sale of development rights to incentivize the construction of high density transit-oriented green buildings. So if you had a parcel of land that was within a certain distance of the metro line or the BRT line, and you incorporated energy efficient and water efficiency standards and green infrastructure, you could then purchase additional building rights to encourage kind of denser development. And it's been successful in reducing outward urban sprawl, sustaining transit ridership, and improving energy efficiency. So I just wanted to end with a few considerations. The first, as I mentioned before, context matters when it comes to designing and implementing value capture tools. What's successful in one place may not be successful in another. One consideration is kind of the legal framework which is often seen as a barrier to implementing value capture. But what we're seeing is that it's not actually particularly constraining. In very few cases is value capture explicitly prohibited. Often it's not explicitly defined, which leads to confusion. So, improvement in the clarity of some of the urban development laws, for instance, may be needed. Equity is really important when thinking about value capture. Inherently in value capture is an increase in land values, which can lead to gentrification and other unintended consequences. But if done right, value capture can help promote greater social equity and kind of distribute the cost and the burden of development more equitably. And then finally, planning matters. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a planner, but to be effective, value capture really needs to be part of a larger urban planning strategy that considers the needs of the community, land use, transportation, ecological services, all of this. Otherwise, the instrument's really not going to be too successful. My last slide, I promise. I just wanted to end with this as kind of a provocation for potential discussion. The quote's from a 2020 Land Use Policy Journal article that's suggesting that there's more to do with value capture. There's more to discover. There's more to innovate in the face of climate change. So despite all of the examples of how value capture is currently being used, it's not widespread for climate action. And there's likely a lot of other applications for it, especially thinking about the scale of action needed to respond to the climate crisis. So, what are some other applications? What are some other innovations that, how else could value capture be used in the new circumstances that climate change is presenting? What are opportunities? What are some challenges? A couple things come to mind about thinking about the amount of land that's needed for renewable energy generation and transmission and distribution. How could value capture be used to avoid land speculation and the windfalls resulting from this transition, this net zero transition? In some places, there's going to be the need for kind of a large scale relocation, unfortunately, to remove people from harm's way. How could land readjustment, how could transfer of development rights maybe complement or be an alternative to buyout programs? These are some of the things that we're currently thinking through, trying to think about how value captures can be an important instrument for climate adaptation and mitigation. I have included some additional resources. I'll share these slides so you have access to this too. But thank you. Sorry, I think I've been talking for way too long. But thank you, and maybe we can have a discussion now.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick. That was everything. I set the bar very high, and I think you exceeded it. So the chat's been fairly active. I'd love to hear some questions or comments on Patrick's presentation.